Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to session 2 of our series on getting to grips with great SEND governance. This session is about evaluating the effectiveness of SEND governance. So welcome to everybody who was able to join us last time. If you weren't able to join us, please don't worry, we're going to do a bit of a quick recap. And if you were here, it's quite a short recap, so don't worry, we're not going to waste too much of your time. Hopefully there will be some useful information, and tonight's session I'm particularly excited about because we've got some wonderful guest speakers joining us as well. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide is just to remind people of the whole school SEND contract aims. We are hopefully going to be meeting these aims tonight by ensuring that everybody feels confident in their role and meeting those training needs that people have in relation to their roles in meeting the needs of learners with SEND in various settings. So this is our sort of recap session, setting the scene for tonight's session. Next slide, thank you. So tonight you've got myself again. I am the regional SEND leader for Lancashire and West Yorkshire. I'm also a national leader of education, and I'm the CEO of the Selfevaluation Trust based in the Northwest. We are a trust with primaries, nurseries, all through special schools and a specialist college. I'm joined tonight by Louise, who is an executive head teacher within our trust, and she is working across a special school and a specialist college. Her function tonight, though, is to be here because she's a trained expert SEND reviewer. We never feel very expert, so I've put the expert in sort of speech marks there. I'm hoping Helen Howe is going to be joining us on the call. Helen is our Deputy Regional Lead for Lancashire and West Yorkshire, and she is a very experienced mainstream secondary SENCO, currently working for the Sefton Local Authority. And we're also joined tonight by David Bennett, who is a mainstream high school SEND governor in Lancashire. He's going to tell you more about his school and the context in which the school is set. And he is going to be particularly sort of useful tonight because he's going to share with us his experience of a school commissioned expert SEND review. Next slide, please. So just a bit of a recap on the things we talked about in the last session. We talked about the national data across the 0 to 25 age range, and we talked about the various settings that children with SEND will be accessing. And we recognise that by further education, around 17% of learners will have identified special educational needs. So they are absolutely a significant minority. And that's why really we're urging all mainstream providers to be really aware of the needs of their SEND learners and what they're doing to meet those needs. We talked about governance models because there's some confusion, particularly with academy structures, as to where legal responsibility for SEND sits. So if that's something you'd like to know more about and you missed the session, please do go and look at the slides there because hopefully that will make it quite clear to you. We talked about the legal requirements for SEND governance, and we focused in on a couple of documents, the Equality Act, which is showing on the side of the screen there, and I think there's possibly an animation there, Francesca, thank you. And we've got Special Educational Needs and Disability Code of Practice 0 to 25 years. Don't worry that you've got the wrong one because it says 2015 on the front. That is the most current version of the document, although it is likely that following the publication of the SEND review that may change in the next year or so. However, that is our Bible that we work to, and it's the chapters in there that we referred considerably to last week. And then we asked participants to actually share their reflections of their own settings, and we were really grateful that you were such a wonderful audience and you did participate massively and put lots of things in the chat. So all those wonderful people who contributed in the chat last time, please do that again because it really makes a difference and we don't feel like we're talking into a little black box. So if you are there, out there in the ether, then tell us about what you're doing, tell us about what you're thinking, and if you've got thoughts that fantastic practice you've got, you want to share with other people on the webinar, then please do that. And finally, you requested something from us. You asked for some additional resources. We were asked for a template for a SEND report to governors and model questions on SEND governance. So we have both of those things prepared, and we're not going to say they're the absolute perfection of everything. However, you know, I always feel if people ask for things, they should get what they ask for. So we will be sending those out along with the slides for tonight's session. So hopefully they will meet those needs that you've raised with us. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to refer to this slide again because it's my favourite slide and I stole it from Nicole, who I keep admitting I have stolen it from, because this is what we're all about. We're trying to be, in our schools, in our settings, inclusive by design. So instead of trying to retrofit and sort of meet need by making specialist provision, what we want to do is think about how do we just make schools more inclusive from the start off. And so we're aiming for that third picture where everybody can see and I think we've decided it's a baseball game, everybody can see the action without having to have lots of specialist sort of adaptations made for them. And if we can do that in our schools with our curriculum, I think we've hit that holy grail. Next slide, please. Last session, we also shared at the very end of the session this slide here and asked you to have a think about it for tonight. So we didn't quite set homework. I apologise if it felt that we did, but you know, sort of it was just to get you appetite whetted for this evening. So what I'd like you to do now, as you look at the slide again, hopefully if you've seen it before, is just identify one or two areas that you see on there where you think that your setting might benefit from a little bit of work, and put that in the chat for us. So that's our first opportunity to really use the chat, so please do. And it's lovely to see we always have quick typists and slow typists. It's absolutely fine. You take your time. If we're 10 minutes in before you get your ideas in, we don't mind. It's a very inclusive space that we're in tonight. Lovely. So do carry on putting your ideas in as we move on through the presentation. Thank you, Francesca. So our session objectives tonight are to look at some relevant audit tools, and these are tools that hopefully will enable self-evaluation of SEND governance. We're going to look at the models of effective SEND governance review, and we're also going to be sharing the experiences of one high school in terms of their experience of SEND review. And you will have an opportunity to put your questions to David and Louise about the process of an expert SEND review as part of that. Next slide, please. So moving into our review tools. Two key documents which are available on the NASEN Gateway, and just to remind people, it's free to access the NASEN Gateway, but you do need to log in order to access the guides. We would ask very, very kindly and most politely that when you sign up that you tick the please receive the newsletter box, because if you do that, then you get added to our community of practice, and we know that you're part of this network of people who want to be involved with NASEN Whole School SEND. So please do tick the box. So the two documents which are there are really for any setting for you to use, as I say, free of charge. There are two versions on the website. There's one that's glossy and pretty, would cost you a fortune to print, and then there's one that's an editable Word document that you can download and you can do what you like with. So, you know, both of them are there for you to use in whatever way you want, and the accessible link is on the slide there, and the slides will come out tomorrow. Okay, thank you. Next slide. So the sort of SEND review tools, both of them have some common themes. And these are the themes that we've just been looking at in the previous slide. And I was asking you to sort of consider in terms of where your areas of priority were. So, you know, these are the key areas that we will be looking at tonight, that we'll be talking about in terms of good practice examples we share in the next session. And hopefully they will be sort of familiar to yourselves. Next slide, please. So the first one, which is the SEND review guide, is a really useful document that many settings are using. And I think somebody's just popped something in the chat about how much they love the SEND review guide and how much they're using it in their own setting. It is actually sort of a document that's there that you can use sort of as SENCOs or as governors or as leaders to just reflect on how SEND is working in your organisation. And you can do that as a self-review on your own, or you can involve other people. And we'll talk about that when we go into sort of the process in the models of review. The idea is, though, that a SEND review will be about creating change, and therefore, you know, it is very much about continuous improvement. So it should lead to an action plan, which is sort of, you know, what you want to achieve with that piece of work you're doing. Okay, next slide, please. There are 8 areas of the SEND review that the document that you can see in front of you, and you know, you can obviously pick and choose. So it's not the case you have to do a complete review of everything. You can just dive into one of those areas and do more of a deep dive into an area where you feel, you know, there's maybe a bit more work needs to be done. Okay, next slide. And the other sort of tool, useful document there is the SEND Governance Review Guide. Now, we're going to unpick this in a bit more detail later on in tonight's session, because this is the one that I think for governors is quite a simple document, but can really help. And I think a couple of people put that board effectiveness was the area that they wanted to look at. And there are some really good prompt questions for assessing board effectiveness around SEND within this guide. So we'll have a look at this sort of page by page in a bit more detail. But it can be used sort of for single settings, for organisation-wide assessment, but also for this sort of cross-setting sort of peer-to-peer work that, again, we'll talk a little bit more about. Next slide. And there's a couple more documents here, and again, this isn't exhaustive. If you go on the Nason Gateway, there are lots and lots of documents you can access, so you know, please do that if nothing else. These 2 useful documents can be really helpful if they're relevant to your particular setting. So there's an early years SEND review guide, which, you know, as the name suggests, is really useful if you're working in an early years setting, or you have early years as part of your organisation. So if you're in a large trust with, you know, some nursery provision or with early years classes in mainstream, it can be a useful document to use for your early years foundation stage. And then the other document that can be fantastic if you are a multi-academy trust is the MAT SEND Review Guide. And that actually sort of focuses on SEND across a MAT rather than just in each individual school. Although obviously it's important to understand what's going on in the individual schools and how they contribute to the totality of how SEND is managed within the MAT. Thank you. So early years, as I said before, suits the early years setting, but, you know, sort of we are very, very conscious of the fact that, as we said last week, early years can be childminders, preschools, day nurseries, a whole range of different settings. So actually having sort of somebody supporting you with that process can be really useful. So the recommendation is that for the early years in particular, that you might want to cluster, create a bit of a cluster model and have somebody work across a cluster of early years providers and settings, helping you to review SEND in your sort of group of settings, rather than each individual setting having to sort of outlay expense for somebody to support them in their setting. So that's worth sort of thinking about if you're part of a network. Okay, and the next slide. And then we've got Multi-Academy Trust SEND Review Guide, and, you know, does what it says on the tin, but it is so important that within multi-academy trusts that the leadership of learning for your learners with SEND does start at the top. So as a CEO of a trust, I absolutely believe it's the CEO's job to be passionate about children with SEND in the trust. And if the CEO is passionate about it, hopefully everybody in the whole trust will have that sense of this is an inclusive trust, we have an inclusive culture. So, you know, again, it's a really useful document. And if you're a trustee on the call, download that one, have a look at it, and badger your CEO to go through it with you. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, there are also other review guides out there. Other review guides are available, also on the NASEN Gateway. So this one that I've highlighted here is actually about the TA deployment. TAs are probably the most expensive resource that you have in your schools and in your trusts and in your settings. So making best use of them is so important. There's some fantastic resources from the Education Endowment Foundation, and also this TA deployment review guide can just make sure that you're actually sort of asking the right questions to focus in on, you know, are we using our TAs as effectively as we can do? And then for me, and I passionately believe this, I'm going to tell you it like it's absolutely true and gospel, all teaching and learning reviews should have a central SEND focus. It's not possible to review teaching and learning in a mainstream school without thinking about both ends of your margin. So you need to be thinking about what's happening for your able, gifted and talented, but also what's happening for your learners who need that additional support. So excellent teaching for pupils with SEND is excellent teaching for everybody. So if we can get that high quality teaching right, then we can make sure that everybody gets a diet that's perfect for them. So as it says there, the additional intervention and support can't compensate for lack of good quality teaching. If the teaching is not good enough, unfortunately, children don't learn, and nobody learns. But the children we tend to notice not learning are the children with SEND and additional needs. So we want our effective SEND governors to have a really good understanding of what high quality teaching looks like, and making sure that they're challenging their schools to make sure that's the norm at all times. Next slide. So I'm going to take a bit of a pause. I'm going to shut up and let you have a bit of time to reflect. So the three things I'd like you to reflect on, and feel free to put your answers in the chat, but if you want to scribble them on a notepad or just think of them in your head, that's fine too. How do you currently self-evaluate SEND in your setting? That's the first question. How are you, as someone responsible for governance, able to contribute to the self-evaluation process? And finally, do you feel you have all the information you require to self-evaluate? So have a little think about that. And whilst people are sort of thinking, I'm just going to ask Francesca, Louise, are there any questions in the chat there that we need to be addressing, or are we just got commentary in there from people, which is fabulous? There's some really lovely good practice being shared as well, I can see as I just sort of flick through, so thank you for that. Okay. So next slide, please, Francesca. So as I sort of, I'm not sure whether promised is the right word, because I don't know how excited you were about the thought of unpacking the SEND Governance Review Guide, but we're going to have a little look at this, and hopefully as we go through the slides you'll pick up on this format. But basically we have the suggested themes and areas to explore, the strengths, areas for development, and who the key stakeholders are who are responsible for that area. So in each section, each page of the document, and this is basically the strategic leadership page, you have the setting demonstrates, and then there are some key points there, and then the board demonstrates and what the board need to be doing. And, you know, how does a board demonstrate anything? Essentially, the board demonstrates through its minutes. So it's really, really important that as a board you feel confident that your clerking processes are strong enough to make sure that they are capturing what can often be quite lively and robust debate. And you do need to make sure there's a way in which the challenge that governors make is actually recorded. Obviously, I'm talking tonight about SEND, but it's actually true of all challenge that is made around the quality of education. So having gone through 7 Ofsted inspections in the new framework with various trust schools and college, I'm feeling quite an expert in sort of being ready for Ofsted. And whilst it's never right to do things just because, you know, Ofsted say you should, it is certainly good practice and makes the whole process much easier if you can very quickly find in your minutes where that challenge happened around quality of education. And wouldn't it be lovely if you could show them some challenge around SEND as well? So, you know, that's my quick tip for tonight. So really what we're trying to do is make sure in terms of strategic leadership that we've got that inclusive sense. So taking us back to the things we talked about last week, we talked about the code of practice, what the code of practice said. I'm sure you all rushed away and read chapter 6 straight away and sort of, you know, you're ready to sit a quiz on it. But, you know, these are the things then that have been picked up through the code of practice. It's about culture, values and ethos. And one of the easiest places to look for, you know, where does the school show its culture, values and ethos is the website. So, you know, if you do nothing else, have a look on the website and just look at how inclusive are you? Are you as inclusive as you think you are? Have you got pictures of young people clearly learning who are actually maybe atypical and don't look entirely neurotypical? Or is everybody on your website beautifully dressed in school uniform and, you know, they're pretty stereotypic? And it's very interesting when you look at different websites that you do get a sense of what people value from a website by the pictures they choose to put up there. So, you know, pictures which are a little bit sort of less scripted maybe are sometimes images which really capture what's happening in a school and that joy of learning that we all want to see. And then in terms of the board, it is actually about making sure that we are actually sort of making the right policy decisions, that we've got risk management in place, which protects the policies and procedures which are there for our SEND learners. Okay, Francesca, next slide, please. The next page of the document talks about accountability. Again, you've got the setting demonstrates. So this is what are we looking for in your setting, and then what are we looking for from the board. And interestingly for me there in the board, it talks about confidence, that robust performance and management processes are in place. And I saw somebody in the chat just a moment ago mentioning something about performance management. Really important, our performance management processes. And in chapter 6, it does say that within your performance management processes, you should be making sure that teachers are responsible for the learning of all learners, including those with additional needs. Changes to relevant legislation and policy. And I mean, the beauty of the document having been in place since 2015 is there haven't been massive changes to the guidance. It's just that we haven't all been great at jumping on the guidance when it first came out and making sure everything it said there happens. So, you know, it is really important to be aware of, you know, sort of what is coming out. And that includes evidence base. And I'd really sort of signpost people to the Education Endowment Foundation. The EF resources are really, really useful, and they produce guidance documents which can really sort of support all learning in school. There's a really good one around involving parents, parental engagement. There's a TA deployment guidance that's come out of the EF, and I can include all these links in the slides that follow up, so you've got that information available to you. And then there's one on mainstream SEND and the things that you should be doing, the 5 things really that are going to make the biggest difference. So if you're looking for, well, where is the good practice, that's where to go to find that information. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you, Alison. It's just popped up. Tiered approach to school improvement is also a FAD EAF document. And please do share in the chat great documents that you know about, because, you know, we're not the font of all knowledge. We don't know everything, and we learn from you as well as you learning from us. So please do share that. Structures and processes then, again, we've got the same format. We've got what does the setting do, how does it demonstrate it, and what does the board do. And in terms of the structures and processes, identification of need is clearly going to be of huge priority, because if you don't identify the right children and identify what their needs are, how can you possibly meet that need? So it is so important to actually have really sort of spent the time in getting your identification processes right. And the data we shared last week, which was the national data for the various age groups that you might be working with, is actually sort of there as a bit of a guide, so you can see, well, are we sort of positioning ourselves in line with national data? And if you're not, that might give you a sort of a line of inquiry, if you will, to drill into, to think, well, yeah, okay, right, we've got twice as many children here with social, emotional and mental health as we would expect in a setting of our size and of our type. Is there something else going on here which is not social, emotional and mental health? There's actually, you know, something that our staff are doing or not doing, which is creating barriers to learning which shouldn't be there. So really important that you get that identification right. And if you were going to go and talk to your SENCO or your leaders about anything, you know, if you ask questions around identification, that's a really good place to start. Okay, yeah, next slide, please. We're looking at people management here. I've already mentioned that obviously a key and very expensive resource in your school is teaching assistants. I apologise for that, Nicole. I notice you're on the call, and that Nicole works in a very exciting secondary provision where they don't have any teaching assistants. They have teachers who they double up and provide support in classrooms, and they meet need in that way. So there are various models, but in most schools there are high levels of teaching assistants, and they do a fantastic job. So we want to make sure that they are being sort of well managed and well deployed, and people are only as good as the skill set they have and the support they have to do their role. And when people are not effective, usually it's a problem with the management of them rather than the people themselves, in my experience. So the more we can do to get the people management right, the better. But sort of actually for governors to understand their accountability towards learners and then make sure that the staffing levels and the staffing systems and approaches support that are really important. And we can go back there to things like the performance management and making sure that the SENCO is not an island who is responsible for all SEND in the school. And it can often feel like the SENCO and the SEND governor become champions for SEND. And then everybody else is able to abdicate responsibility because the SEND governor is doing it for the governing body and the SENCO is doing it for the school staff, and it's all sorted. And in actual fact, it is actually about relationships, isn't it, and people working together. So yes, the SEND governor might be doing a bit more of a deeper dive into SEND, but they're going to be feeding that back to the whole board, and it's the board that's going to make the difference. And the SENCO may well be the specialist who has all sorts of knowledge, but they're cascading that knowledge to teachers, because it's the teachers who are there all day, every day, and are going to make a difference to the children. So, you know, that's why people management is so important. Okay, and if we look at the next slide, evaluation. So, you know, we're very fond of evaluation in education. We love our plan, do, review, and we want to make sure that we make sure that the outcomes that come out of all the investment we make in SEND are actually sort of feasible and we can see what's happening. So systematically scrutinizing the data and saying, yes, we do all this lovely stuff, but does it make a difference? And it's that what if, and, you know, sort of actually drilling into the impact that we've actually had with everything that we've done at all times. And I think that sort of the head teacher is really key in terms of being responsible for all the evaluation of the school. So the self-evaluation, people may contribute to it, but it should be the head teacher who owns the whole school self-evaluation, including the evaluation of SEND, the SEND data. And so it's perfectly right that the governing body should be able to sort of interrogate, is a bit of a rough word, I feel, but should interview, should ask questions of the head teacher about how effective SEND is in the school and how resourceful resource is being used and how effective that resource is? And if it's not effective, that's not a problem, is it? It's just, okay, well, we tried that and it didn't work, so let's change it. And it's really important that it's kept under that constant review. So not a sort of, you know, once a year or even once a term sort of process, that the review is happening sort of every time interventions take place. We've baselined the young people before they start, we baseline them at the end, and we have an opinion about how effective that particular intervention was. Okay, thank you. Next slide. So I'm just going to give you another pause for reflection and a break from my voice whilst you have a think about SEND review tools. So the first one is, how do you know how effective your setting is? Then you've got, how confident are you about your board's effectiveness? And finally, who is responsible for maintaining board effectiveness in the area of SEND? And if anyone feels brave and wants to put their answers to that in the chat, we'd love to see them. There's no such thing as a wrong answer. So, you know, you can put whatever you like in there. I think that's a good point, Noreen, that the staff governor shouldn't be the SEND governor. Too much conflict of interest. I think I'd absolutely agree. Particularly not if it's the SENCO. That would be fairly disastrous, I think, because you could end up talking to yourself. Some really interesting things coming through the chat there. And I think, you know, making sure that you're getting pupil voice and parent voice is so important. A couple of people making that point. And I love that, Linda, thank you. Everyone's responsible for SEND. You've made my day. and Alison, everyone's responsible on the board for the effectiveness of SEND. And that's interesting, Julia's point there, that since joining a MAT, there's a sense that, I'll just pick that one up and share it with you. Julia says, I must admit that since we've joined a MAT, the ownership of SEND and its drive across local governments has become less visible. And, you know, I would absolutely sort of say that there isn't a need for that. And, you know, sort of my sort of humble advice there would be to talk to trustees about, you know, sort of what can be done about that, because, you know, certainly if you've been a local governing body with a strong sense of SEND and managing and owning SEND, then you wouldn't want to lose that in a MAT. That's great. Okay. Interesting comment there about, as an academy, from Gail, as an academy, difficult to access the resources of the LA. I think it very, very much depends on the LA. Our MAT is sort of across 2 local authorities. We have a very different experience. I won't say which one. On such a public call, but on a one-to-one, I'd be happy to share my opinions. Yeah, it does actually sort of make a difference if you are actually in a local authority which is quite pro-MAT and very supportive, and lots of the small unitary authorities have got a lot more MATs in them, so they're a lot more in tune with working with MATs and sharing resource between maintained and schools that are in trusts. Whereas I think that in some local authorities where there aren't as many multi-academy trusts, they haven't quite got their heads around how to work, you know, with those trusts. Thank you. Keep your thoughts coming in the chat. That's really wonderful. Thank you. We're going to move into looking at some review models now. and share a bit of information about how you might go about reviewing SEND for yourselves. So the important thing about sort of understanding SEND review is any school, any setting can actually undertake a SEND review, and a SEND review can be as big or small as you want it to be. There's no rules really. And that includes things like settings like alternative provision and special schools, and indeed within the paperwork, within the review paperwork and the SEND review guidance, there is a separate sheet for the self-evaluation for AP and special, so that you've actually got something which is a little bit more tailored maybe to your setting, particularly around data, because that tends to be where you've got a lot of different stream, mainstream, special and potentially AP as well. But actually that capacity to do a review, you should be able to use the guide documents we've shared in any setting. Obviously, the focus for a SEND review should be about children. So it's not about, beating people with a big stick. It's about getting better outcomes for children with SEND. And so we've got to think about the journey that children are on and where they are in their journey. So if you're in the early years, obviously transition into education is really important, because that's going to be the children's next step. If you're in primary, it's about that transition to secondary and making sure that young people are well equipped to sort of cope with what the secondary school feels and looks like. And then again, as we transition into Key Stage 5 college and beyond into work. So, it is really important to have that sort of preparation for adulthood sort of agenda in your heads from the outset. So even if you are in the early years and you think, well, actually they're a very long way off adulthood, that doesn't mean you can't start that preparation. And what does preparation for adulthood look like when you're 3? Well, perhaps it's you putting on your own apron rather than a teaching assistant doing it for you. So focusing on independent skills and getting children to be as independent as possible might be as far as it goes, but that's your strand for preparation for adulthood. We've got a series coming up in the spring term, so I'm going to do a shameless plug now for preparation for adulthood series, which will look at the universal, targeted and specialist offer, and that will be another webinar series presented from Lancashire and West Yorkshire. So if you can join us for that, that'll be fantastic. Or if there's somebody in your setting who you think would really benefit from that, then let them know. So why do people sort of commit to a SEND review? There are a variety of reasons. On the slide here, we've got a sort of list of some of the reasons that people have wanted SEND reviews. One of my favourite requests for a SEND review that I had was a large high school in a multi-academy trust, won't name them, who asked for a SEND review because their Senko was rubbish and they wanted to get rid of her. And what the head teacher said to me was, we would like to get rid of the Senko and we would like you to create the bullets for us to fire her with. At which point I did point out that that isn't really what a SEND review is about. A SEND review is about taking an objective view of what's going on and giving pointers for development. At the end of and it was a 5-day deployment, so it's quite a big piece of work. Actually, we found the Senko was very effective, but just not given enough time to do their job effectively. And actually, she knew her children incredibly well. She provided all sorts of support for staff, but she didn't have the support of the leadership. So staff didn't actually take notice or own the things that she provided for them for support. So by the end of it, we had a very different conversation about the Senko and the value that the Senko could bring to the school. And I bumped into her 6 months later and she said she felt like a different woman. So that's the power of a SEND review for you. It can change people's lives, okay? So next slide, sorry, Francesca. So self-evaluation. That's the easiest and the cheapest way of doing a SEND review, is to just do it yourselves. And if you've got no resources, and I know there's always settings out there where you absolutely have no resources, get the guide, download it, it's free, and then you can use that as a template to work through and decide, whether or not you're actually doing a good job. There's a little document that we will send out to people with the slides, and it will be sort of something really useful to you that was created with the local authorities in the Northwest and is based on other research that was out there produced by Ask, and it just actually sort of gives you a bit of a framework of what good sort of looks like, and sort of a little bit of a sense of sort of, if you're here now, this is what you might want to do next to move yourself on. So we'll be sharing some of that in the next session, and we'll make sure that comes out to you. So really important in self-evaluation is who is owning the self-evaluation, who's responsible, because if we're not careful, it does end up being the SENCO who owns this self-evaluation of SEND, and that's not really the point. We need to make sure that we are very focused on sort of everybody owning the SEND review and everybody taking part, which is why when we do go into schools to do SEND reviews, we always ask to speak to senior leaders, and if the head teacher is not available, we'll ask for a phone call afterwards, because we want them to feel they are part of this process, because if the senior leadership don't buy in, we're not going to affect that change that we were trying to make happen. There's obviously a process of reflection, and reflection has to be open and honest. Some people are very good at painting a lovely picture of what happens, which isn't what goes on. And then there's got to be a sort of energy for action. There's got to be a sense that we're going to take action as a result of, the findings that we make. And the evaluation process is really key, because that's really what brings it all together and turns it into a usable action plan and allows us to move forward. Okay, next slide, please. So why would you want to engage in a self-review? Well, bullet point 2, I think, is possibly the one which, will cheer most people up. It's free. It just gives you a better understanding, like any self-evaluation, of where are your strengths and where are your areas of weakness, and gives you a sense of what you might do about those things. It's also the starting point for the deeper SEND review. So if you're going to commission a review, you would still start with a self-review. It is not a way of getting out of doing self-review. You have to do that first, so that your peers or your expert can help you to sort of unpick what's going on. So the self-review process is present in all types of review, really. Okay, next slide. So the next type of review, if you've done your self-review, is to go for a peer-to-peer review. And this is really where you can work with somebody else in another setting, and actually sort of you show me yours and I'll show you mine, and actually sort of collaborate, communicate, and sort of share your practice. The danger is, of course, if neither setting has good practice, what's being shared may not be entirely useful. However, sort of one would hope that by putting heads together, there's an opportunity for people to sort of look at things in a joined up way. Certainly in a MAT, in a structured larger organisation, there's a really good opportunity for peer-to-peer review to be set up, where people can actually sort of collect and collate the information and communicate across the trust what good practice looks like. And it is really good professional development for those people involved. So, for SENCOs who are going and looking at each other's practice in different schools, that can be some of the best professional development that they have, really. Personally, a triad system seems to work better for peer-to-peer review, because you have the opportunity to share across, sort of 3 people. It's not quite as personal. And where we've engaged in peer-to-peer reviews, we've always gone with that triad sort of approach, so that it's 2 people looking at another person's practice and contributing. It's also not quite so lonely for the reviewer, because they've got somebody to bounce their sort of emerging findings around with. Okay, next slide. So the 6-stage process, and this is the same process for an expert review as it is for a peer-to-peer review, so I'll talk it through now, and then I won't talk it through next time. So first of all, you identify and you request you're going to have a review. Then you complete that self-evaluation, so that's the document that's in the SEND review guide. You go through that. You then prepare, and the reviewer sort of, if it's a peer-to-peer review, you will ask each other for certain information. You'll go on each other's websites, you'll have a look at what's available in the public domain, and you'll get a picture in the preparation of what you want to do. That then allows you to design a school visit, Sorry, I appear to have lost that slide. Can we just put that one? Sorry, thank you. You then have your school visit where you sort of, you carry out your review and you have a look at things, you have a look at practice in the classroom, you actually talk to children, you talk to staff, you may talk to parents, you may do a sort of questionnaire of some description to get feedback from parents. How each school visit looks, it tends to be bespoke to the school itself. And then there's an opportunity for a report to be written and then some kind of follow-up just to see how that's going, how the report's landed. I've just shared here, so there, lovely. I've just shared here the 9 principles of peer-to-peer review. So this is the National Association of Head Teachers, who are, obviously a very reliable sort of source. And these points here in terms of peer-to-peer review are almost for me a bit of a checklist in terms of how to work and to work together when you're doing peer-to-peer review. Obviously, there's got to be a commitment to improving everybody. So you don't go into peer-to-peer review just to make your life better. You go into it committed to improving each other, and that's obviously really important. Being action focused and making sure that it doesn't become a bit of a cozy club. There's no point in just identifying stuff and saying, oh, that looks good, that doesn't look good. You do need to sort of say, well, that was great, and it will be even better if you did these things. And that kind of model of even better if tends to be quite positive, because it's not saying there's anything wrong with what you're doing, it's just giving people the opportunity to elaborate and build on. Okay. Sorry, Francesca, we've got some kind of ghost in the system, haven't we? That's okay. Then we've got this sort of need to be rigorous and objective. And when it says truly honest appraisal, obviously there's a way of being honest, and how we treat each other with dignity and respect is really, really important in any type of review. Structured and robust, so that we're not just saying, yes, that's super, when it isn't really, and we actually make sure that the actions we're coming up with are going to be owned by the school that's taking it on. Expert and evidence-led, so the expert and evidence in this doesn't need to be somebody else, but if the practice is being shared, then has it come from a credible source? Absolutely done with and not to the school. Totally important that the school feels engaged and owns this. We're not Ofsted. SEND review is something completely different. It's about a developmental process. And if we work in that way, then you develop that sort of bond and that trust where people are prepared to be more vulnerable and say that, things aren't working, and that's so important. And for me, the joy of doing SEND reviews is you build such powerful relationships with people, and you get the opportunity to impact on sort of a wider range of settings than just your own. So for the reviewer themselves, it's a really affirmative process that feels really positive. And finally, it is that sort of continuous improvement. So, Rome wasn't built in a day. Let's have an action plan. It might be a 5-year action plan, but that's fine, as long as we know where we're headed and how we're going to get there. Okay, next slide. And then why engage in an expert review? And David and Louise are going to tell us loads more about this, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. You can use an expert to lead a peer-to-peer review. So you could have your triad approach and then still have an expert in there who's just helping to sort of consolidate thinking and to draw out sort of themes and practice. You can actually sort of get recommendations from experts, because typically they'll be coming with a bank of knowledge that should be evidence-based, and they're able to sort of maybe drill into issues in a bit more depth and detail. For SENCOs, working alongside an expert reviewer can be a really good development for them, because it's helping them to actually sort of learn new skills. And in a larger organisation, actually getting experts in can help to explore SEND themes across the trust rather than just at an individual school level. Okay. Next slide. So expert review, exactly the same process. So we won't talk you through it again, but that's the process we go through, 6-stage process. Next slide. Okay, so thinking about your own setting, this is your point of reflection. What type of review model do you think might work for you? And do you have the resource and the knowledge to engage in effective self and peer-to-peer review? Or do you feel you would need to be bringing in some kind of expertise? Just have a think at this point. And again, if you want to put reflections in the chat, then please do. And I think Linda's point there about the SIAMS inspection, yeah, you've got to be really careful of overload, you know, and people can only cope with so much review at one time. So absolutely, if you're preparing for another type of inspection, whatever that might be, then sometimes it's not the best time. However, in some cases, it can be helpful because it can give you an action plan to help you, through the review process. So it's very much setting specific what will work for you, and what your staff can tolerate. We've always got to be mindful of workload, and we don't want to do anything which increases staff workload, particularly in these really difficult times when teachers are really struggling to actually sort of manage teaching in the classroom under COVID pressure. Thank you, Jenny, there for the voice of special schools. That's fantastic. So the CEO of the Matt's done a SEND review on the two mainstream schools as a special school. That's really good practice. Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Okay. And thank you, Alan. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move into some reflections on SEND review. So the way that this is going to work is it's going to be a question and answer session between Louise Parrish and David Bennett. Louise and David are going to introduce themselves to you and explain how this is working and why they're here tonight. If you've got questions, please put them in the chat, and Nicole, Francesca and myself will field them to you, and just to sort of not field them to you, sorry, we'll field them to Louise and David, so if you're asking Louise something, if you can put L, and if you want to ask David something, if you put D. That's nice and simple, isn't it? I think at this time of day on a Thursday, I think that's probably hard enough for us all. Okay, so without further ado. So Louise, are you going to come in and introduce yourself? Thank you.
Sorry, I wasn't sure whether we did it or whether Francesca took us off mute. Apologies, everybody. Good evening, everybody. Really pleased to be here and really excited I've been invited to share and reflect upon the SEND review that I did at Haslingden High School, and I'm so pleased that David, SEND Governor, accepted my invitation to join me this afternoon, because David, you're the one that's going to be most of the talking. I'm just going to be asking the questions. We have planned them in advance, haven't we, David? So not too much pressure there. Yeah. So in terms of me being an expert, okay, so why am I an expert? I do ask myself that question quite a lot, but I'm an executive head teacher across 2 SEND provisions, spanning ages from 4 all the way through to 25. And within the provisions, one of the schools is 4 times outstanding. I'm a teacher of SEND and have been for 24 years. Yes, I am that old, can't believe it's 24 years, and a leader of SEND for 19 years. The provisions that I've led are generic learning difficulties provisions, therefore meeting the needs of a wide range of ability, and I have therefore expertise in meeting needs of learners across the 4 broad areas of need. I am a trained SEND reviewer and have been for 4 years, and I have an extensive experience in supporting mainstream schools and improving their SEND provision. The SEND review that we did at Haslingden High School took place in March 2020. And I took the opportunity to take a colleague along with me to increase the tariff to 2 reviewers. The colleague wasn't a trained reviewer, however, they were training to be a reviewer, if that makes sense. And so it was good CPD for them to come along with me and learn about the review process ahead of doing the official training as a reviewer. I think it's important probably to note that both the school in which I'm executive head teacher and Haslingden High do have a really strong relationship. Learners, our most able learners at Torview School, attend Haslingden High School every morning, and it's part of our commitment to ensuring that we can meet the needs of our learners who are the most able. So there was that long-standing relationship, and it has been for what probably is about 16 years. So David, over to you if that's okay, please, and introduce yourself and a little bit about the school, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Louise. First of all, good evening, everybody. And Louise, thank you and Angela, thank you for inviting me this evening. I'm a governor at a state-maintained school in Lancashire. It has a roll of 1,600, and about 190 of those children are on the SEN register. I've only recently been appointed SEN governor as I was looking for a new challenge, and fortuitously, I'd done the training about 6 months before. I had no idea that there'd been an internal review or a peer-to-peer review because we didn't have any SEN governor. And so I was invited to come along to the external review, which is set up, as Louise said, last March.
Thank you, David. So we have a number of questions that I'm going to put to you, if that's all right, David.
By all means, yeah.
Is that okay? And we'll start with the first one. So can you tell me why the school commissioned a SEND review?
Well, there was a number of reasons. I mean, the first one was to obtain an expert and unbiased overview of the school's leadership SEND and the quality of teaching and learning for the SEND pupils. But also the 8 points that was mentioned earlier, the interaction with parents and pupils, the identification, tracking and evaluation of pupils, resources, and the quality of SEND overall. And the second one, we'd already, as I mentioned, although I wasn't part of it, conducted an internal review. And it was really to confirm the school's own findings and to acknowledge any that were further identified by you and to accept your recommendations. It also gave the SLT link, which was the deputy head, and me, a greater understanding of the daily workings of the learning support faculty, its strengths, its areas for development. It was better to inform the SIP the strategies for reducing that gap and to give the confidence to support and challenge as appropriate. And finally, it was to support the SENCO's own evaluation of the provision. Okay. So that was, it was a very thought out and a lot to achieve.
The school commissioned a 2-day review. That's right, isn't it, David?
Yes.
It's a rather large high school, and therefore we felt that we needed to spend 2 days really just to get under the skin of the SEN provision. So as a governor with responsibility for SEN, what was your contribution to the review?
As I said to you at the time, I wasn't sure that I was contributing, although I was assured I was in some shape or form. Really, I saw it as a perfect opportunity to see an expert drill into our provision, identify the strengths and weaknesses, and I could bring out questions directly to you in answer to some of my queries. And it was really to advance my own development. So in terms of contribution, I didn't feel that I was, but I definitely felt that I was comfortable being part of that review.
You absolutely were, David, and indeed, when we put the agenda together, I think we identified a specified time, and I do remember David on day one saying, "Can I come back tomorrow?" You know, you you were part of the process for the whole 2 days and asked some really good questions. And it was great to have you on that journey with us. So can you comment, please, in terms of the SEND review process, how it felt?
Well, I can only comment on a personal point of view, because I know that you spent a lot of time with the SLT, interviewing teachers, the SENCO, the pupils, and you really spent a lot of time in the school. But I was with either you or Richard throughout the 2 days, and I found that you were, it's not like being an Ofsted inspection. I didn't know what to expect, but it was nothing like that. You were very inquisitive, but you didn't appear to challenge at any point. It was very comfortable, and you responded very well to my constant questions with patience and goodwill. And I just felt I spent a really good day, 2 days well spent. So it was a very good experience, a very positive experience. I didn't feel threatened, I didn't feel challenged, and I just very pleased to be part of it, quite frankly.
And so it definitely felt as though it was done with rather than done to, David.
In fact, I saw that earlier on. I saw that comment on the slide that Angela put up, and yes, absolutely, I agree with it 100%.
Great, great. So what would you identify as the most valuable outcome, David?
I think there was, for me, it developed my understanding of the school's SEND provision, and allowed me to support and challenge the school, because I didn't have that experience before. And to be fair, nor did any of the other governors. I don't think we'd ever had a SEND governor before. But from the school's perspective, of course, it informed the SIT, it validated their own evaluation, and it identified where the resources need to be placed to reduce the gap.
Brilliant. And were there any unintended outcomes?
Well, yes, that weren't planned for, but I think, it's my own view, I don't know what yours is, but I felt it increased the relationship with your school and identified how we could access your expertise for faculty training in the future. And of course, the other thing was that, which wasn't totally unexpected, and I'm really pleased with, it developed a greater understanding and common language between the SENCO, the senior leaders, and the governors. And in particular, I don't know if anybody else is aware of it, I'd never seen it before, this golden thread, which is a fantastic document. I don't know if that's familiar to other people. It certainly wasn't familiar to our school, and now it's the backbone of everything we do with SEND.
It's just that it's not necessarily a document, David, it's an approach where we follow a golden thread right through from the education healthcare plan straight through all the way down to what's going on in the classroom. And it's a really good exercise, and one that you know, I tend to do as part of a SEND review. One of the things that, you know, I'm really interested to hear from you, David, is because the point of the SEND review is around sustainable change, isn't it? And sustainable improvement. So has the review contributed to sustainable school improvement? And if so, why and how? Well,
in a number of ways, because looking back and reflecting on the review and identifying areas, one of the things I've found very useful is the interaction and the working between the TAs in the class, the SENCO and the faculties, the teachers and the pupils is not only developed, but it's consistent. There's constant CPD. It's not a one-off job. There's constant conversations with curriculum leads. There's bulletins, and it's doable. It's not a one-off. It doesn't cost any more money. We've done it, and we can keep on doing it. And from that perspective, I think it is sustainable forever, and it will just keep developing. One thing I should mention, when I decided to become a SEND governor, I was looking for another challenge, but I was looking at documents, and you know more than me, forgive me, I don't know the gentleman's name, but he did a presentation to NASAN, and it was talking about raising the visibility of SEND and making it everybody's responsibility. Now, I took that on board, and I took it back to my governing board and really shoved it down their throats. I use that because I use a big stick. When I was training governor, I only had one tool, it was a big stick. I had a carrot every now and again, but the big stick always worked. And what I got every governor to do was to do the training. So they've effectively done the same training as me. And what we got also, we built SEND into the top agenda of every meeting. And now governors are aware that any discussions that are made about curriculum, the question is then asked, how has that impacted on SEND?
Great, great. And finally, would you recommend a SEND review? I think you've probably already answered this question, to be fair, David, but I will ask you, would you recommend a SEND review to other schools and why?
Well, yes, I would. And I'd just say, I refer you to my previous comments. But basically, it was really a relatively low cost. And if I could explain, it was excellent spend of money. But if I explain that, if we'd have sent one teacher or one SENCO or one governor off on a course, there would have been a cost. But we got you, and that information we then took down to all the staff and all the governors. So very well spent money.
Great.
And I'd recommend it to anybody.
Brilliant.
I hope that's of help.
It is, absolutely, David. And like I said, thank you so much for giving up your time and obviously fighting the fight for those SEND learners in your school. Fantastic. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Can I say, as a guest here, that I've listened to this presentation and I've made loads more notes and I've got even more stuff to take back with me. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's good. That's great. That's fantastic. I was just looking at the questions and I can see one from Jess, which is about the golden thread approach. So Jess, the strategy that I use during a SEND review is starting with the education healthcare plan outcomes, looking at those and then tracking those through to the annual review. So are they present in the annual review? Are we setting annual targets towards those key stage EHCP outcomes? Then from the annual review, I'd like to look at individual learning plans, IEPs, whatever the school calls it. And again, can I see that golden thread? Can I see those outcomes that are then set as annual targets in the annual review? Can I see those present in ILPs? Then I'd like to see the learners in the classroom. Have a look, are those teachers aware of those ILPs? Are they aware of the young person's targets? Then from the classroom teaching, I'd look at pupil books. Again, can I see that golden thread of those targets making and outcomes making all the way down through into pupil books? And then finally, pupil voice as well. So talking to the learners, asking them, are they aware of their outcomes? Are they aware of their targets? And so on and so forth. So it's just that idea of there should be a golden thread very clearly from your EHCP all the way down to what's actually happening in the classroom. So that's my golden thread approach. Are there any other questions?
I think it's just worth ILP. Do you want to just say what you mean by ILP?
Yeah, an individual learning plan or an individual education plan. Different schools call them differently, but that's where I'd be looking to see short-term targets. So we have our annual review targets, which are set for the 12 months, but an individual learning plan will break those down into small achievable targets for, you know, half a term or a term. Oh, great. Glad I answered the question, Jess.
So I think that, and Alison has said, and I think to you, David, really, that basically, I love it when SEND governors stand up for SEND. So there you are, you've got a cheerleader there. Okay, so I think that sort of, you know, and I have to say, you know, you were so nice, David. I feel like, you know, people will feel that we've scripted it for you.
Oh no, that's really from the heart, the way I feel. Thank you.
You know, and I absolutely appreciate, somebody had made the comment, I think it's Rebecca, had put the comment in the chat about, you know, she would love to get that opportunity to spend 2 days in school and you know, go through a process. And I know there was another colleague who'd said that she'd had, I think it was a safeguarding review, was it, that had been very positive. and felt that, you know, that had been a really wonderful experience, being able to work alongside a reviewer. But, you know, it is a luxury to have time to do that. And we're absolutely conscious that governors are volunteers. And, you know, for many of you, just managing to get to the board meetings is, you know, a huge sort of effort, and, you know, massively appreciated by the settings that you support. So there's certainly no expectation within a SEND review that a governor would be there for the 2 days. But, you know, it is, as David said, that valuable learning experience. So at the moment, Louise and I have been commissioned to do 12 SEND reviews across a trust. And in that part of that work, we're hoping to develop the skills of the SENCOs in those settings, so that they will then be able to continue with a peer-to-peer review process when we're not there in the future. So, you know, those sorts of systems of having an expert in, but it's about how are you transferring the skills from the expert, because we don't want to create a model that's not sustainable and you keep having to buy in people over and over again. So I think that was really positive, David, when you said that, you know, it was the case that you now felt that there was a self-sustaining system in place as a result of that, which is really good. And the fact that you think you've learned extra stuff tonight is, again, really positive.
Absolutely.
So yeah, just looking through, I can't, Nicole, can you see, are there any questions anybody's got particularly?
Yeah, there's a question in the Q&A.
Oh, it's a question in the Q&A. You're looking in the right place. You want to ask the question?
Yeah, it says, how does this, it's from Alison, and it says, how does this impact on provision expected at SEND support, so for children not yet or not likely to need an EHCP?
The
Golden thread, I'm assuming, yeah. So how would you work that system for a young person on SEND support? So you haven't got the HCP to start off your journey. So how would you use the golden thread for SEND support?
So yeah, absolutely. There is no EHCP or annual review, but most schools for those learners on the K register will have pen portraits. So it would be, again, starting with a pen portrait and working that through to, you know, what's actually going on in the classroom and the pupil voice. And also, one of the things I was in a school yesterday, in a high school yesterday, that I was looking at for the learners on the SEND register was about how do the teachers contribute to the review of their SEND needs. So one of the things was I was looking at paperwork where the SENCO has asked for teachers to contribute to that, and you know, and reminding them that every teacher is a teacher of SEND, and that those learners are their responsibility. So that would be the work that I would be doing at that level for those who are on the K register, not with an EHCP.
Thank you. Anything else there, Nicole, that you can see?
There's some general comments in the chat. There's nothing else in the Q&A at the moment. I
think somebody had mentioned the provision expected at SEND support. And again, there's guidance around that we can provide the link to. I think, is it Alison's put something in the chat about that? So we can put the link in there for people who are interested in that. Alison's point is ensuring that schools and governors understand PIAS is so important. So we'll put the link in there for you around that. There's a message as well from Lisa Sheppy. About, you know, I'm a chair of seven school MAT and I want to create a trustee link role, but I'm unsure how to make this purposeful. Well, you will be delighted to hear, Lisa, that in our final session, session 3, we have a link trustee from the Co-op Trust, Jill Robinson, who is Jill Robinson OBE, a very experienced SEND professional, and she's going to share with you how that works in their trust. So, you know, that hopefully will be really useful to you, and hopefully, having sort of heard Jill speak, you'll be able to make that really purposeful across your trust. And then there's somebody else who said that they think that we're going to be doing a SEND review in their school, which sounds really exciting. I'm really looking forward to seeing you. Okay. So anybody else got any more questions that they would like to put in? Nicole's going to be frantically scouring, so please do sort of put anything in that you've got.
Yep. There's something in the Q&A again. Does the review look at governance too?
There you go. Louise, did your review look at governance too?
Absolutely. Yeah, part of the golden thread exercise really in terms of part of the review is to meet with governors, like I said. So David was invited and decided to stay for the 2 days, which was amazing. But it's again that golden thread exercise, starting with governance. You know, what's their view? Where is the culture around SEND? And then working that way through. So triangulating that with the school improvement plan, working that through with other school leaders. Again, working all that way down to ultimately the learner that's in the classroom. But like I said, you know, David was invited, but did stay for the 2 days, and you know, found that really valuable and useful. So yeah, lots of triangulation within the review around, you know, that's what your governors are saying. Is that the same message that your senior leaders are saying, your middle leaders, your class teachers, and all the way through to the experience of the learner? We didn't speak to any parents during the review, but again, that's another layer of the golden thread that can be added if it's needed. And the agenda for the actual review day is determined by the self-evaluation. So the reviewer will have time to look at the self-evaluation and then find lines of inquiry or things that they'd like to see more of, speak to certain people about.
I'd like to add something, Alison, that didn't occur to me previously. I'm alive.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay.
Carry on.
One of the other unexpected, I mentioned that everybody had done the training, and what wasn't anticipated, and no one coerced them into doing it, as the governors, the linked governors visited their separate faculties, they're all armed with questions they were going to ask the mainstream teacher about they dealt with and handled and looked after the SEND pupils in their class and how they engaged with the TA. And that was another thing that we brought forward, and training the governors took that into the classroom. And I thought that was very positive.
Thank you. I've just noticed there's somebody asking a question about what is the key. So a couple of people have mentioned in the chat the key. So the key is a sort of a resource, essentially an online resource, which many schools buy into. You do have to buy into it. You can buy into the key for school leaders, and there's also the key for governors. And so, you know, it's basically a decision for your school to buy in. There are some really good resources on there, I have to say, nothing to do with them. I'm not doing a shameless plug for them. It's just genuinely quite a useful resource if you're wanting model policies, documents, job descriptions, you know, those kinds of things. There are lots of those things on there. And as new sort of documentation comes out, the key will sort of do a summary document of lots of new sort of things which are being released by the DFE. So it can be a really good way of keeping people in touch. As a trust, we buy into the key because we find it useful, and our governors and our trustees find it useful. But you know, it is one of those things. But Linda's just said, because I think it's a very recent relationship, isn't it, that there's now a relationship between Governor Hub and the key, and there's a sort of a package, isn't there, where you get Governor Hub and the key for your sort of subscription. So those people who are familiar with Governor Hub, that's a really useful sort of resource. Fantastic for putting all of the documents for your governing body in one place. So, you know, and myself, I'm a trustee at another trust as well as being CEO of my trust. So when I go into my Governor Hub, I've got my other trust, I've got the trust that I work for, I've got all of my schools, I've got all the documentation for the full governing body, the finance, audit, resource and risk committees, the curriculum and standards subcommittee. So, you know, all of that information is available very quickly and easily, and it basically is it's a database that holds your information, but you can sort of also record your register of pecuniary interest on there. You can also sort of record whether or not you've read Keeping Children Safe in Education and you're updated and things. So again, a really useful tool for governing bodies if you're not familiar with it. But at the end of the day, it's sort of one of those things where, you know, sort of it might be worth your school having a look at it, but we're not on commission. So Just sharing it if it's useful to you. Oh, thank you, Alison. I think it is a bit like a washing line, isn't it, on Governor Hub? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all. I think, well, sorry, Francesca, could you just put the slides up to just check that we have finished going through the slides? But thank you so much, David and Louise. That was absolutely fantastic. It was really nice to sort of hear a good news story about how Send Review can work.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for joining us. So are we okay, Francesca? Do we think we finished the slides? So there's I think there's some information slides, aren't there, that are on the back. So when the presentation comes out, you'll see there are a few more slides, but they are just sort of further information for you. You know, thank you all for really joining in. You've been amazing participants. It is like talking into sort of a black box. So just getting those bits of feedback that you've put in the chat have been fantastic. Really hoping you can all join us again for the final session. Francesca, do you want to just remind people when that is?
That will be the 25th of November.
Super. So hopefully you will all join us then, and as I say, we'll have the delight of hearing from Jill about that Link Governor role, and we'll also be sort of sharing some of the other good practice sort of guidance and documents that are out there that can help you to just sort of, you know, make a decision about whether or not you're on the right sort of tracks with things, and, you know, give yourself a little bit more information and advice to move forward. So thank you so much for joining us, and look, we've saved you 9 whole minutes of your life that you can have back. All right. Bye now. Bye bye.